The morning of the auction, there were 34 head of sheep nobody wanted. They were a motley collection, a genetic scramble of breeds that had been culled from a half-dozen different flocks for a dozen different reasons. Some were old, their coats the color of dishwater, their frames sharp and angular beneath the thinning wool. Others were young but slight, the runts of their litters, born with a fragility that marked them as poor investments. They were penned together in a muddy back corner of the stockyard, away from the prime Black Angus bulls and the robust Suffolk ewes, whose pedigrees were recited by the auctioneer like verses of scripture. These 34 were the footnotes, the afterthoughts, and the air around their pen was thick with the quiet resignation of things deemed to have no future. The other farmers, men with hands like worn leather and faces mapped by sun and worry, walked past them without a second glance, their eyes fixed on the pens where muscle and good breeding promised a return on investment. They were headed for the meatworks most likely, for a price that would barely cover the cost of transport. Into this theater of practical assessment walked Evelyn Hayes. She was 28, though the city she had just left had etched a weariness around her eyes that made her seem older. She wore boots that were not yet broken in, and a jacket that was too clean for the mud and manure of the stockyard. She was an outsider, not just in her attire, but in her very bearing. She had returned to the valley a month prior to bury her grandfather, and now she was simply there, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of the community. She walked past the valuable stock, her gaze sliding over the prize-winning animals without interest. She did not stop until she reached the back pen, the one with the 34 mistakes, and there she stood. She watched them for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable. She did not look at them as a rancher would, assessing their weight or their teeth. She watched them the way a person might watch a slow-moving creek, observing the subtle currents and eddies, the way one sheep would shoulder another for a better position at the hay rack, the way a particularly old ewe stood perfectly still, conserving an energy that had become a precious commodity. The auctioneer, a man whose voice could carry across a field in a high wind, finally got to them. His tone shifted, losing its booming enthusiasm and taking on the flat cadence of a necessary chore. All right, folks, lot 107, 34 head, mixed ewes and wethers. What they are is what you get. Let's start the bidding at, well, let's just start it. Who will give me $20 a head? The silence that followed was heavy and dismissive. The price was an insult, but even so, no one moved. The auctioneer sighed. All right, 15. $15 a head for the lot. It's a truckload of mutton, boys. A few men chuckled. It was Dale Harding who spoke up, his voice loud enough for everyone under the corrugated iron roof to hear. Dale was a man who farmed with spreadsheets and bank loans, his operation a gleaming testament to modern efficiency. His farm was the biggest in the county, his cattle the heaviest, his opinion the loudest. $15 is high, Jimmy. You're pricing in the cost of the hole you gotta dig to bury 'em. A wave of laughter rolled through the assembled crowd. It was cruel, but it was the kind of practical cruelty that passed for humor in a place where sentimentality was a liability. It was into that wave of laughter that Evelyn raised her numbered card. The auctioneer squinted, genuinely surprised. I got a bid. Ma'am, is that a bid at 15? Evelyn gave a single, sharp nod. The laughter died down, replaced by a murmur of confused whispers. Dale Harding turned to look at her, a slow, patronizing smile spreading across his face. 15 once, the auctioneer called, his voice regaining a little of its rhythm. 15 twice. He looked around, giving Dale a chance to turn it into a joke, to run her up for sport, but Dale just shook his head, still smiling that infuriating smile. He was content to let her have her folly. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot. To number 73 for $15 a head. Evelyn lowered her card and walked to the clerk's window to pay, the eyes of every man in the place following her. As she signed the receipt, she could hear Dale Harding's voice, pitched for performance. Well, she just bought herself 34 funerals. That girl will be broke and gone inside a year. Mark my words. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Evelyn had returned home not out of choice, but out of a kind of gravitational pull. The city, which had once seemed like a vast constellation of opportunities, had revealed itself to be a cold, indifferent machine. Her small graphic design business had failed quietly, not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding erosion of dwindling contracts and rising rent. A process as subtle and final as shoreline disappearing into the sea. She had been living in a small apartment that was always filled with the sound of other people's lives, and she had felt a profound sense of being unmoored, of floating without purpose. Then the call came about her grandfather, Samuel Hayes. His heart, a steady and reliable engine for 87 years, had simply wound down. And so she packed her 2 suitcases, settled her debts, and drove the 500 miles back to the collapsing farmhouse she had inherited, a place she had only visited for a few weeks each summer as a child. The farm was not a prize, it was a burden, 160 acres of memory and neglect. The white paint on the 2-story house was peeling away in long, curling strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath like skin flaking from old bone. The porch sagged on the east corner, a permanent, tired sigh. The barn, once the proud heart of the operation, leaned a few degrees to the north, as if perpetually bracing against a wind that had blown itself out decades ago. The pastures were a tangle of thistle and burdock, the fences a lacework of rusted wire and fallen posts. The community consensus, which reached her in the form of sympathetic but firm advice from the real estate agent who handled the will, was to sell it. Sell it for the timber rights, sell it to Dale Harding, who was always looking to expand his empire, sell it for whatever she could get, and use the money to start over, somewhere else. For the first 2 weeks, that had been her plan. She slept on a cot in the dusty living room, ate canned soup, and tried not to see the ghosts of her grandparents in every worn patch on the floorboards. But then, something shifted. It happened one morning as she was standing on that sagging porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. She was looking out over the overgrown fields at the way the early light caught the dew on the spider webs that laced the tall weeds together. She had expected to feel overwhelmed, to feel the weight of the decay as a crushing presence. Instead, for the first time since her business had begun its slow spiral, something in her had settled. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been her companion in the city was gone, replaced by a silence so vast it seemed to have a physical presence. She saw the place not as a collection of problems to be solved or a liability to be liquidated, but as a single breathing entity that was simply waiting. That day, she called the real estate agent and told him to take the property off the market. She didn't have a plan. She had a small amount of money from her grandfather's life insurance, enough to live on for a year if she was frugal, and that was it. She decided that instead of running from the burden, she would try to understand it. It was in the 3rd week, during a systematic cleaning of the house that was more about avoiding the future than dealing with the past, that she found the notebooks. They were in the bottom drawer of her grandfather's old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture she remembered as a forbidden territory from her childhood. The drawer was stuck, swollen shut by decades of humidity, and she had to work it open with a pry bar, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, there were no stock certificates or land deeds. There were 12 thick, leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with her grandfather's elegant, slightly slanted cursive. She expected to find records of income and expenditure, the dry accounting of a farmer's life. And those things were there, recorded with meticulous care. But they were only a small part of it. The books were something else entirely. They were the field notes of a man studying something he loved. He had recorded the date of the first frost for 50 consecutive years. He had sketched the flight patterns of the hawks that nested in the tall pines at the edge of the property. He had detailed which wildflowers bloomed first in the south pasture after a long winter, and which ones thrived during a dry spell. He wrote about the soil, not in terms of its chemical composition, but in terms of its color, its smell after a rain, its feel in his hands. He described it as a living thing, a partner in his work. He wrote about his animals with the same intimate attention. He noted which of his cows were clever enough to find the weak spot in a fence line, which ones were natural leaders, which ones were attentive mothers. His entries were not just data, They were observations steeped in a deep, philosophical patience. He wrote about the weather not as an adversary, but as a conversation partner. An entry from 1978 read, "Dry June again. The clover is suffering, but the deep-rooted chicory is happy. The land is telling me what it wants to grow, and my job is to listen, not to shout my own plans back at it." As Evelyn read, late into the night with only the light of a single lamp, she felt as if she were being introduced to the grandfather she had never truly known. The man she remembered was quiet, gentle, and smelled of hay and pipe tobacco. The man in these pages was a scientist, a poet, and a philosopher of the land. His approach was the polar opposite of everything she saw around her in the valley. While Dale Harding and the others were conquering their land with bigger tractors, more powerful fertilizers, and more specialized high-yield breeds, her grandfather had been engaged in a decades-long act of surrender. He had sought to understand the intricate systems of his small corner of the world and to work within them, not against them. One phrase appeared again and again, underlined in 3 separate entries across 20 years. The ground remembers. It seemed to be the central thesis of his entire life's work. The ground remembered the plow, the poison, the overgrazing, but it also remembered the rest, the care, the fallow seasons. He believed the health of the farm was not a line going ever upwards on a graph, but a circle, a cycle of depletion and replenishment. Another recurring theme was a deep skepticism of debt. "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do," he wrote. "It is a cage built of promises. A free man farms only with what he has." It was this line that was in her mind when she drove to the auction. She didn't go to buy sheep. She went to listen. A week after the auction, Evelyn drove her grandfather's rattling pickup truck to the other side of the county, to a small, unpainted house at the end of a long gravel road. This was where her great-aunt Ada lived. Ada was her grandfather's older sister, a woman well into her 90s who was as tough and unyielding as the rocky soil she inhabited. She still wore her late husband's denim work shirts and kept her gray hair cut short and practical. She was known for her silence, which was not an empty thing, but a dense, considered presence. People said Ada could sit on her porch for a whole afternoon and say less than 10 words, but that those 10 words would tell you everything you needed to know. Evelyn found her splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a stark counterpoint to the quiet of the surrounding woods. Ada stopped as the truck approached, resting the axe head on the chopping block and watching her great-niece get out. Evelyn brought the notebooks with her. She sat at Ada's worn kitchen table, the air smelling of wood smoke and coffee, and explained what she had found. She spoke of her impulse purchase at the auction, of the 34 unwanted sheep now grazing uncertainly in her overgrown pasture, of the laughter from the other men. Ada listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond Evelyn's shoulder, as if she were watching the story unfold on the far wall. When Evelyn was finished, the old woman was silent for a long time, her gnarled fingers tracing the rim of her ceramic mug. Finally she spoke, her voice a dry rasp. "Samuel was always listening," she said. It was a statement of fact, not an appraisal. The others got loud. They bought bigger machines to make more noise, so they wouldn't have to hear how tired the ground was getting. Your granddad just got quieter. She reached out and touched one of the open ledgers, her finger running over the familiar script. "This is real," she said. "The rest of it, the big loans and the fancy sheds, that's just a storm passing through. This is the bedrock." Evelyn felt a knot of uncertainty loosen in her chest. It was the first time anyone had validated the strange pull she felt towards her grandfather's way of thinking. She asked Ada about the sheep, about her seemingly foolish purchase. "Did he ever buy the culls, the ones nobody wanted?" Ada took a slow sip of her coffee before answering. "He didn't buy culls," she said, her eyes meeting Evelyn's for the first time. "He bought survivors. He always said the animal that thrives on a perfect farm with perfect feed is a pampered guest. The one that gets by on a hardscrabble patch, the one that's a little tough, a little smart, the one the others push out. That one is a partner. That one has the sense to live. He used to watch for the ones that stood quiet in the middle of the pen, while all the others were shoving and panicking. He said they weren't weak. They were just listening." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. It was exactly what she had done, without even knowing why. She had stood and watched, and she had been drawn to the quiet ones. Ada gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of profound approval. "You've got his eyes," she said, and in that moment, Evelyn knew she was on the right path. The work began, and it was slow and unglamorous. It was the opposite of the dramatic, brute force transformations favored by the modern farmers in the valley. Evelyn didn't clear-cut the overgrown pastures with a brush hog. Instead, following the detailed, hand-drawn maps in her grandfather's notebooks, she began to restore the old system of rotational grazing. This involved weeks of mending fences by hand. She spent her days digging post holes in the rocky soil, stretching new wire and patching the old. It was back-breaking labor, and it left her hands blistered and her muscles aching with a depth of fatigue she had never known. But as she worked, she learned the contours of her land. She learned where the ground was soft and marshy in the spring, where the deer came to browse at dusk, where the best wild blackberries grew. She was not imposing her will on the land. She was reintroducing herself to it. Once a small section of pasture was secured, she moved the 34 sheep into it. They were wary at first, unused to the richness of the forage after the barren holding pen. Her grandfather's notes were her guide. Let them graze it down by half, no more. Then move them. The land needs to be stressed to grow stronger, but not broken. So every few days she would open a gate and herd the small flock into a fresh paddock. Behind them, the grazed pasture was left to recover. It was a slow, rhythmic dance of movement and rest. The work was mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. A passing driver on the county road would see only a small, shabby flock of sheep in a messy field, and a lone woman wrestling with fence posts. They would not see the complex ecological system being carefully brought back into balance. They would not see the native grasses, no longer choked out by weeds, beginning to reestablish themselves. They would not see the soil, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to darken and hold more moisture. The county's true circulatory system was not its roads, but its gossip, and the heart that pumped it was the feed co-op. It was a cavernous building that smelled of molasses and dust, a place where farmers gathered for coffee and conversation while their trucks were being loaded with grain. The co-op was run by a man named Elias Pratt, an old-timer with a quiet demeanor who had known Evelyn's grandfather well. It was here that Dale Harding held court. He and his lieutenants, other farmers who emulated his high-input, high-debt model, would sit on upturned feed buckets, pontificating on market prices and weather forecasts, and increasingly they talked about Evelyn. Their mockery was cloaked in a kind of false friendliness. "Hey, Evelyn," Dale would call out when she came in to buy a block of mineral salt. "How's that flock of ghosts doing? Any of them decided to lie down and die on you yet?" His friends would snicker into their coffee cups. Evelyn, remembering her great-aunt's quiet strength, refused to take the bait. She would not get defensive or angry. She would simply meet his gaze with a level, unreadable expression and answer the question plainly. "They're eating," she would say, or, "They seem fine." Her refusal to engage, her utter lack of heat, took the fun out of the question. It was like arguing with the weather. It gave no satisfying resistance. Her calm, factual responses left them in an awkward silence, and they would soon turn back to topics that offered more friction. She would pay for her salt, nod to Elias, and leave. But she could feel their eyes on her back, their judgment as solid and heavy as a wall. To them, she was not just a curiosity, she was an affront. Her quiet, small-scale, debt-free experiment was an implicit criticism of their entire way of life, and they could not abide it. Elias Pratt, the co-op owner, saw it all. He was a man of few words, much like Ada, but his eyes missed nothing. He had watched Dale Harding's rise, had seen the parade of shiny new equipment, and the ever-present shadow of the bank loan officer. He had also known Samuel Hayes, had respected his quiet wisdom, even when it was out of fashion. One afternoon, as Evelyn was loading her salt block into the old pickup, Elias came out and leaned against the truck's fender. He was silent for a moment, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light coming through the co-op's open doors. "Don't you pay them any mind," he said, his voice low. "They laughed at your granddad, too." He told her a story about how, 30 years ago, Samuel had been the only farmer in the valley who refused to plant the new, high-yield hybrid corn that the agricultural extension was pushing. He stuck with his open-pollinated heirloom variety. The other farmers, Dale's father included, had mocked him relentlessly. Called him a museum keeper, Elias said with a dry chuckle. Then the blight came through 2 years later, wiped out nearly every field of that new hybrid. But it didn't touch Samuel's. His corn had the sense to live, I guess. He ended up selling his seed corn to the very men who'd laughed at him for twice the price. He pushed himself off the fender. What you're doing, it takes patience. And patience looks like laziness to a man in a hurry. It was the first real encouragement she had received from anyone besides Ada, a small, solid stone of validation in a river of doubt. The first sign of tangible success came not with a dramatic event, but with the quiet accumulation of small victories. The sheep, against all of Dale Harding's predictions, did not die. In fact, they began to thrive. The rotational grazing on the diverse, recovering pastures was like a powerful medicine. Their coats, once thin and ragged, grew in thick and dense with a surprising luster. The lanolin in the wool made their fleeces feel heavy and rich. They put on weight, not the bloated, fast-grown weight of grain-fed animals, but a solid, muscular heft. They were still a motley-looking crew, a patchwork of shapes and colors, but they moved with a new vigor, and then in the spring, the lambs began to arrive. Evelyn, guided by a chapter in her grandfather's journals titled On Midwifery, spent a month sleeping in the barn. The old ewes, the ones who had been dismissed as being past their prime, proved to be excellent, experienced mothers. They delivered their lambs with a minimum of fuss and knew exactly how to care for them. The survival rate was astonishingly high. Evelyn noted each birth in a new notebook of her own, her neat print a deliberate echo of her grandfather's cursive. She recorded the details without ceremony, but when the last lamb was born, a sturdy little ram from the quietest of the old ewes, she allowed herself a moment. She sat on a hay bale in the pre-dawn chill of the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals and new life, and she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle over her. It was the feeling of a thing well made, of a promise kept. Her first sales happened almost by accident. Elias Pratt had stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to see how a new type of fencing staple was holding up. As he was leaving, he paused and looked at the flock, now dotted with energetic, bouncing lambs. "You know," he said, "my wife's been looking for some good local lamb for a family dinner. Can't find any that doesn't taste like cardboard." On a whim, Evelyn sold him one of the young wethers. A week later, he was back. "Evelyn," he said, his usual reserve replaced by a quiet enthusiasm, "I don't know what you're doing out here, but that was the best lamb I've eaten in my life. It tasted clean, like the pasture." Word began to spread through the slow, reliable channels of the valley. A neighbor bought too. The local veterinarian, after treating one of the ewes for a minor cut, asked if she had any for sale. She never put up a sign, never placed an ad. The business grew organically, pulled forward by the undeniable quality of the product. People started calling it Burnt Fork Lamb, naming it after the small seasonal creek that ran through her property. The name stuck. It was simple, authentic, and it had emerged from the community itself, not from a marketing meeting. It was a brand built on the very principles her grandfather had lived by. Let the quality of the thing speak for itself. That summer, the conversation of the weather, which had for so long been a gentle murmur in the background of valley life, turned into a harsh and relentless shout. The rain simply stopped. June came and went with only a few tantalizing sprinkles that evaporated before they could even darken the soil. July was a furnace, the sky a pale, hazy blue, the sun a white-hot disk. The creeks dwindled, then disappeared, leaving behind cracked, serpentine beds of dried mud. The local paper began calling it the worst drought in living memory, a 50-year event. For the conventional farmers of the valley, it was a catastrophe. Their fields of high-yield corn, plants bred for perfect conditions and dependent on immense amounts of water, began to wither. The leaves turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle brown, rattling in the hot wind like paper. The lush, single-species pastures of ryegrass and clover, which provided such rich feed in a wet year, were shallow-rooted. They burned up, turning the rolling green hills of the county into a uniform, depressing shade of dusty tan. Dale Harding's massive center pivot irrigation systems, the pride of his operation, ran day and night. But they were pulling from a water table that was dropping at an alarming rate. They were fighting a losing war against the sky, and the cost of the fuel to run the pumps was ruinous. Farmers began to sell off their herds, unable to afford the skyrocketing price of hay trucked in from other states. The auction yard where Evelyn had bought her 34 sheep was now flooded with desperate men selling off their life's work at a fraction of its value. But on Evelyn's farm, something impossible was happening. Her land, the 160 acres of neglected pasture that everyone had dismissed, was still green. It was not the lurid, artificial green of an irrigated field, but a tougher, more resilient mosaic of greens, olives, and even some tans. The deep-rooted native grasses, the chicory, and the plantain that her grandfather had so carefully cultivated and that she had allowed to reestablish themselves were tapping into moisture far below the surface, moisture that the shallow-rooted commercial grasses couldn't reach. Her rotational grazing system had, for over a year, been building up the organic matter in her soil, turning it from dead dirt into a living sponge that held on to every precious drop of dew and the rare fleeting shower. Her sheep, the tough, genetically diverse survivors, were perfectly adapted to this kind of foraging. They were not picky eaters. They browsed on the tough-leafed plants that the pampered commercial breeds would ignore. They were thriving. The sight was so jarring that it became a local phenomenon. People would drive out on the county road and pull over just to stare at her farm. It was an island of green in a brown county, a quiet, irrefutable testament to a different way of doing things. The skeptics, who had once driven by to smirk, now drove by in a state of stunned, grudging silence. They were finally and completely understanding what they were looking at. They were not looking at a woman's hobby. They were looking at their own failure and her profound success. One evening in late August, when the drought was at its most vicious, a dust-covered truck rumbled down Evelyn's long driveway. It was Dale Harding. He parked near the barn and got out, moving with the slow, heavy gait of a defeated man. He was alone, and he held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in a nervous gesture that was completely at odds with his usual blustering confidence. Evelyn, who had been checking the water trough, watched him approach. She didn't say anything, just stood by the fence and waited. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze sweeping over the pasture behind her, at the healthy ewes and their sturdy lambs grazing peacefully in the fading light. He looked at the green grass. He looked at the clear, steady flow of water filling the trough from the spring-fed cistern her grandfather had built. He looked back at Evelyn. His face was a mask of exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite name, a kind of grievance against the order of things. He cleared his throat, which was thick with dust and pride. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out flat, without flourish or excuse. It was not an apology, not in the way most people would understand it. It was a confession, a plain statement of fact, delivered with the same blunt pragmatism he applied to his cattle prices. He had built his world on a set of assumptions, on a belief in the supremacy of force and capital in modern science. He had looked at Evelyn's methods and seen weakness, nostalgia, and folly. Now the undeniable evidence of his error was all around him, in the green of her grass and the brown of his own dead fields. He had made a prediction, and it had been proven false in the most public and devastating way imaginable. "You were right," he added, the words costing him more than any check he had ever written. He didn't just come to confess. A man like Dale Harding did not operate without purpose. After a long, heavy silence, he looked at her flock again, this time with a farmer's eye, but a new kind of farmer's eye, one stripped of its arrogance. "Those rams," he said, nodding towards two young, powerful-looking males. "They're from your original stock?" Evelyn nodded. "They're good," he said. "They're built right." "Hardy." He took a deep breath. "I need to change what I'm doing. It's not working. I'm drowning." It was another stark confession. He then made her an offer. He didn't just ask for advice. He asked to buy her two best young rams, at a price that was 4 times what anyone would have paid for them a year ago. He wanted to breed their resilience, their sense to live, into his own devastated flock. And more than that, he asked her if he could pay her for her time, to walk his own land with him, to tell him what she saw, to teach him what her grandfather knew. It was a complete and total surrender. He was not just admitting his error, he was asking the person he had mocked to become his teacher. Dale Harding's conversion did what Evelyn's own success alone could not. It gave the rest of the valley permission to believe. Dale was their bellwether, the man whose lead they followed. When word got out that he had not only admitted his mistake, but was actively seeking Evelyn's counsel, the tide of community opinion turned, swift and irreversible. The whispers at the co-op changed from mockery to grudging respect, then to open curiosity. Other farmers, men who had laughed along with Dale, started showing up at her farm. They came with their hats in their hands just as he had, their questions tentative at first. They asked about her grasses, about her grazing patterns, about the old breeds of sheep. Evelyn became an unlikely teacher. She didn't lecture them. She did what her grandfather would have done. She showed them. She walked them through her pastures, had them crumble the dark, rich soil in their hands, pointed out the diversity of the plants. She shared passages from the notebooks, her grandfather's quiet wisdom echoing across the decades. She gave her knowledge freely, understanding that the health of her own farm was ultimately tied to the health of the land around it. The valley was beginning to heal, not just from the drought, but from a deeper ailment of forgetting. That fall, a local teenager started helping her after school. His name was Leo, a quiet, serious boy who didn't say much, but whose hands seemed to understand the work intuitively. He knew how to handle the sheep without spooking them, how to string a fence line so it was perfectly taut, how to spot a ewe that was feeling unwell before she showed any obvious signs. He had grown up on a farm that had been sold off piece by piece to cover his family's debts, and he carried a quiet sadness about him. But on Evelyn's farm, he seemed to come alive. He would read her grandfather's notebooks during his breaks, his brow furrowed in concentration. Evelyn paid him a fair wage and taught him everything she knew, seeing in his quiet diligence a reflection of her own journey. He was not just an employee, he was an apprentice, the first link in a chain of knowledge being passed to a new generation. He was proof that the legacy would not die with her. The drought broke, as all droughts eventually do, and the valley slowly began to recover. But it was a changed place. The principles of resilience, of working with the land instead of against it, had taken root. Faced with a sudden demand for her lamb, her wool, and her breeding stock, Evelyn was advised by the local bank manager to take out a substantial loan to expand rapidly to capitalize on her success. She politely declined. She remembered her grandfather's words. Debt is a cage built of promises. She would grow her operation, but she would grow it the way her land had taught her to grow. Slowly, patiently, letting the resources she had dictate the pace of expansion. She would grow the way the land could grow, letting demand pull the operation forward rather than letting debt push it. Her business philosophy was as organic and sustainable as her farming. 2 years later, great-aunt Ada passed away in her sleep. She had lived to see her brother's farm reborn, to see his wisdom vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The week before she died, Evelyn had driven out to her little house. Ada was frail, confined to a chair by the window, but her eyes were still sharp. She looked at Evelyn, who now wore the confidence and competence of her role as comfortably as she wore her worn-in work boots. Ada didn't say much. She simply reached out, her hand as thin and dry as a leaf in autumn, and patted Evelyn's arm. She gave that same, almost imperceptible nod from their first meeting in her kitchen. Samuel would be proud, she whispered. It was all she needed to say. Her death was not a tragedy, but a closing of a circle. It marked the final quiet transfer of the mantle. Evelyn was no longer just the keeper of the legacy. She was the new wise elder, the carrier of the knowledge. The story ends, as it began, at the auction yard. It is 5 years after Evelyn bought the 34 sheep. She is there not out of desperation, but out of deliberate choice, looking for a specific bloodline to add a new thread of genetic diversity to her now famous flock. She stands by the rails observing the pens, her gaze calm and discerning. Dale Harding stands beside her, no longer the swaggering king of the county, but a quieter, more thoughtful man. He is there to learn, to watch how she sees, to understand the subtle cues she looks for. A pen of thin, unremarkable-looking ewes is brought up, a lot that in years past would have been met with derisive laughter. But this time, a respectful silence hangs over the crowd. The men look at the sheep, and then they look at Evelyn, waiting for her judgment. She watches them for a long time, just as she did that first day. Then she gives a small, decisive nod to Dale, who raises his card to bid. This time no one laughs. The community now understands the value of what she saw all those years ago. They understand that the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing if you only know how to read it. The narrator's voice concludes with a slow, reflective cadence, summarizing the lessons learned not just by the characters, but by the land itself. That patience beats money and attention beats force. That the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest. That a legacy is not a static inheritance to be sold or squandered, but a living conversation to be continued. It is the understanding that true wealth is not measured in yield per acre, but in the resilience of the soil, in the health of the system. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that worth does not need to argue, does not need to boast, does not need to explain itself to a chorus of doubters. Because in the end, in the face of the fire or the flood or the long, hard drought, worth does not need to make a case. In the end, it simply proves itself.